This is a podcast that seeks justice. Justice for the lives stolen by those in society that hide amongst us every day. Hidden in our towns, cities, and countrysides, the places that we work, and sometimes in our very own homes. This is Hidden Killers.
Welcome to the podcast. Be sure to press subscribe wherever you download podcasts so you don't miss any of our breaking updates and discussions on the cases that we are following for you. Today, we are joined by one of my favorite clinical and forensic psychologists. She's also a licensed private investigator, Joni E. Johnston. Thank you so much for being here. Can you speak to the character of Bryan Kohberger, what we know thus far? Narcissist seems to be the key word that is being thrown around a lot in the public. With more and more information coming out about his character, most recently his inability to keep his teaching assistant job due to his sexist remarks, unreasonable grading techniques, and inability to follow direction. What does this tell us more about who he is and how his mind functions?
Well, it's really interesting that came out because the word narcissism has been thrown around these days to mean just about anything.
Yes.
From, you did something I don't like, to you broke my heart, to somebody who truly is so self-absorbed that, it's obvious to everybody.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important, and I'm really happy that you've started with these behaviors, because we really do have to look at the person's behavior. Narcissism, well, let me say a couple of things. All of us have some degree, hopefully, of healthy narcissism, or, a healthy level of self-interest. And when we talk about somebody whose narcissism becomes a problem in their lives, we're talking about something much more extreme. We're talking about narcissistic personality disorder. Mm-hmm. And that is really rare. It's relatively rare. It's about 1% of the population can be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. And, when we're trying to look at somebody and kind of go, how narcissistic is this person? It's important to realize that, this is a personality disorder, meaning it is pervasive in that person's life across time and across settings. And that's one of the challenges, I think, when we're looking back at somebody who's committed a horrible crime. Mm-hmm. Because certainly we can say, what this person did was unbelievably self-absorbed, lack of empathy, all those things. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have narcissistic personality disorder. However, when we start seeing things like, here is somebody who was given numerous chances to change their behavior. And, being a former doctoral student myself, I can tell you, Tony, programs typically bend over backwards to keep people. Yeah. They are not interested in kicking people out of the program because they've invested time. They're thinking this person has a lot of potential. And so, if you look at the kind of the timeline in terms of the disciplinary process for him, he was given several opportunities to change his behavior. And, what it suggests is at this point in his life, I'm never going to diagnose somebody that I haven't evaluated, but at this point in his life, he has clearly decided that he is going to be a certain way and act a certain way, and that's more important to him than anything else in his life. So that is certainly, more of a clue that this has become a personality issue for him. Now, the other possibility is this is somebody who, since June of, months before, had begun stalking people. Mm-hmm. And so an alternative possibility is that this is somebody who just has kind of given up and knows where he's headed. He is going to commit this crime. And so at this point, he didn't care.
Sure. Why is it, speaking on narcissistic personality disorder, why is it so hard for them to change their behavior? And can someone with the NPD actually change? Or is it something that is just, it's in you, this is how you are, society, look out?
Wow, those are such great questions. I think the first one is, if you think of the world being divided between, people who create pain and people who experience pain, mm-hmm. When you look at people who have personality disorders, other people in their lives will describe them as the pain givers. Yeah. In other words, part of someone who truly meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder is they tend to externalize everything. It's never my fault. Yeah. It's always somebody else's fault. Anything bad that happens to me. I'm better than everybody else. I'm special. I'm unique. If that is your belief system, Why would you change that, Tony?
True.
Right?
I mean, why would you change it? I guess if everyone is going along with it, you have no reason to change that. But when you start having very volatile relationships and things are falling apart around you, but I suppose at that point, you're still not looking at yourself introspectively and saying, it's me that's causing these things. They just kind of keep moving down their own path, blazing their way, and everybody's off on the side of the road trying to realize what the hell just hit them.
Well, I don't think it's quite that black and white, because I do think you're absolutely right. There are people who get to a point in their life, particularly as they age, when they start really facing the fact that there's a common denominator in, relationships that failed or, jobs that failed. And they start being more willing to take a look at, okay, the common denominator might be me. And so there is enough pain in their lives, or they get in trouble in some way. And they're forced to kind of go into therapy and look at that, where they do come in. Because one of the things, and it's so hard, I think, to think about it in this way, that when we think about narcissistic personality disorder, we think of it as kind of being this like excessive self-love. And it really isn't. It's like an excessive love of this idealized version of who they are. And the roots of that, we think, that it's almost like a defense mechanism. That at some point this person felt very insecure, very less than, and over time develops this kind of shell or this false belief system. And so they have a lot of energy invested in maintaining these beliefs they've developed to kind of compensate. These beliefs that I'm so special, that I need to be the center of attention all the time, that I don't have to earn special treatment, I deserve it, and those kinds of things. If somebody can be in therapy long enough and get underneath that, because it does take a lot of energy, right?
Yeah.
To organize your world in that way, then it is possible for somebody to gradually change their behavior. The challenge, I think, a lot of time is for people who are in relationships with individuals who have this diagnosis, is that oftentimes, as I mentioned, the incentive to change is not there, and it's too threatening to that person to consider it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And when there is the threat, how do they react mentally? What's going through their brain that it is so difficult to work through those sort of things?
Well, if you think of this kind of self-image as survival from an emotional standpoint, then think about how threatening it would be to think about being taken away. Yeah. It would almost feel like I'm going to die in a way if this is taken away from me. And so, I actually did some research on kind of narcissism and violence, because every time somebody commits a murder, they're described as narcissistic.
Yeah.
And so I was really interested in looking at, okay, is there a relationship between narcissistic personality disorder and violence?
Yeah.
And in fact, what you find are two things. One is, of course, most people with NPD are not violent, but NPD does seem to increase violence risk. And so then you kind of think, so, it's kind of like, again, most people who have NPD are not violent, but there is a greater risk of violence if somebody has NPD.
Sure.
And then you kind of go, okay, well, if that's the case, under what conditions would somebody with this diagnosis be most likely to become violent?
Yeah.
And you think about, okay, well, if their image is threatened in some way.
Yeah.
Or if they're rejected in some way. And that's pretty much what you find. That, not only do people with NPD often exploit and manipulate other people to kind of protect their image and get their needs met, they often are very hypersensitive to any criticism. Because again, nobody likes to be criticized.
Sure.
Don't get me wrong. I don't like it. You probably don't like it. Nobody does.
Sure.
But most of us can evaluate it.
Yeah.
We can kind of go, okay, well, I don't like this, but let me step back and kind of go, is this true or not? Why is this person saying this? If I have this image to protect that's so vital to me, then that can feel like betrayal.
Yeah.
And they're going to, people can react with this rage and this anger. And there's a term that it's kind of a, not a clinical term, but this kind of narcissistic rage people will talk about, where somebody becomes enraged at the slightest criticism
Yeah.
or the slightest threat, because again, that image is so important that anything that threatens it is intolerable.
Was this almost like the perfect storm for Kohberger, where he was getting this criticism of professionally on his behavior and at the same time being rejected by women? And it was those two things of just he couldn't cope. He could not take a look in the mirror and go, well, what do I need to change about my personality or how I'm approaching things to better suit whatever my goals actually are. Instead, there's such pain there that rather than do introspective learning, it's rage. And that's the narcissistic rage that comes out. Because if you look at the timing of some of these things, where he was sat down by professors and said, okay, you got to get this under wraps. It was the day before the killings was one of those meetings. And we don't know, the true timeline of what interactions or any interactions that he had with the girls, but one must assume there's got to be something there at some place in time of some sort of rejection. And those two things coming down at him at once, does that create a breaking point in a narcissist?
Well, I certainly think that, if indeed Bryan Kohberger is the murderer, if he is, convicted in a court of law, what I think is interesting about that is when you look at individuals who have fantasies of murder, and they begin planning. So, the fantasies can exist for years for people. And then, the problem or the danger comes when those fantasies start becoming plans. And so at some point, if it was the caveat about if he is in fact the murderer, in June, he starts maybe stalking people, trying to reach out to them and those kinds of things. Well, then the question becomes, why then would he commit the murders? And what we find when you look at mass murders, when you look at school shooters, workplace violence, serial killers, you often find a trigger. And the trigger is not at all the cause for the murder. It is the impetus for it. It's like there's been this kind of storm brewing for months. The storm is getting bigger and bigger. The person is now taking action, or they're taking steps and plans and thinking about how I would do it, not if I would do it, or, should I do it? But, let me start this planning process. But this planning process can go on for years. I mean, I've talked to people who fantasized and actually, created scenarios in their head for years. But almost always there was some event that just kind of tipped them over. And I suspect that if all this stuff that's coming out is true, again, if Bryan Kohberger is the murderer, if in fact, he was let go and all this, that kind of, being fired, being disciplined may have been the impetus for him.
That's
to kind of go, it. That's it.
That makes sense. One more thing on this. I want to ask your opinion. I know 1% is the average of the population that has narcissistic personality disorder. Do you think that's an accurate number, quite honestly, or do you think it's much higher? Because this is something also that doesn't necessarily get diagnosed that frequently, because narcissists are not going to be the ones to raise their hand and say, let me take a look at this. Let's have a doctor evaluate me.
That's a great question. You're right. If you're a narcissistic personality disorder, raise your hand. Who's going to raise their hand?
Exactly.
But so I think a couple of things about that. There's been some pretty interesting research that does support that. Now, narcissism, like any other personality trait or disorder, is on a continuum. We have to figure out as psychologists how we're going to diagnose people. And so it kind of becomes like, okay, at this point you have it. But in reality, all of these personality characteristics are on a continuum. And so the research suggests, again, and they're pretty creative in ways of kind of, measuring this. So they're going to give people, a large percentage of the population will get surveys and psychological tests that don't say, do you think you're narcissistic? Right. They'll just measure different beliefs.
Okay.
Right, that people might have if they have NPD. So they can be pretty creative, I think, in terms of how they evaluate that. But there's also some research that suggests, 1% is kind of at the extreme end, and about 6% has a high degree of narcissism. So there are people that we would have problems with in our lives because they're just people that we think are just incredibly self-interested, self-centered, and self-absorbed.
Sure.
But they don't meet the clinical criteria. So is it possible, you make such a good point, Tony, that, there are a lot of people who are walking around that we would never know? Possibly. But I do think, like I said, when the researchers go out there, they have some pretty creative ways of measuring some of these traits and behaviors that are consistent with somebody who has that diagnosis.
Great insight as always. Joni Johnston, clinical forensic psychologist and licensed private investigator. Be sure to press subscribe wherever you download podcasts so you don't miss any of our breaking updates and discussions on the cases that we are following for you right here. You can follow me on Twitter @TonyBPod. I'm Tony Bruschi. For all of us, thanks for listening.